Before we get into this episode, I want you to reflect on the following question. What is your relationship with visibility? Do you have a fear of being seen? Do you associate it with being performative? When you think of being seen, does your mind immediately go to the risk or the opportunities it comes with? While you take some time to think about it, let me introduce myself. Hi, my name is Alayjah, but you can call me Lay. Welcome back to A Little Atypical, a space for the deep feelers and unconventional thinkers navigating wellness, personal development, and lifestyle with a little more nuance. I'm here to bring fresh energy to the beauty, wellness, and personal development space by having the curiosity to dig beneath the surface. I like to talk about typical topics from a not so typical perspective, and that's exactly what we're going to do today. So, as I'm preparing to record this episode, it is May 15th, and I don't know whether or not this episode will be posted on the 18th like I originally planned or the 25th. Honestly, I was trying to create this so it wouldn't fall on Memorial Day, but with the combination of working on my Substack and getting sick on Wednesday, things just fell short. Basically, I have a goal to move my older posts onto my Substack, starting with all my podcast bonus content that is already, done and created, and then I will work on the ones from my high school years, college years, and then the non-show notes from my post-graduation. And last but not least, once I'm all caught up scheduling, I will start to write again. But I honestly haven't written in quite a while. For years, in general, I haven't been happy with my host site, but being that I'm not the most tech savvy, I didn't know how to transfer my content, and the host site doesn't make it easy. So I do want to continue working on transferring things manually and maybe having like copies on a hard drive in case, but it's a lot of behind the scenes things I am working on, and in life things I'm working on as well. But specifically the Substack aspect is something I did want to bring up because today's topic, as you can tell from the title, is all about visibility and how it feeds into agency. The question of the episode was actually inspired by how I felt called to do this micro goal. Obviously, I've been creating since 2018 solo. Before that, I had, social media like every other teen. But blogging was the thing I did with my in-person best friend at the time. Before that, basically, I collaborated with my Hawaiian friend through middle school and early high school to write on Wattpad. And after that came the fashion and beauty blog with my in-person best friend. I'm saying all this because in terms of writing, especially in my post-graduation, I was taking aligned action the whole time. I was creating, but I realized creating was kind of where I stopped in the process. I didn't always share what I posted to my social media platforms, especially once I started wanting to be less public about what I had going on. And honestly, with the podcast and now my Substack, I started noticing how challenging it felt to take my work from just being made to being seen. That's when it clicked for me. I wasn't struggling with creativity. I was struggling with the concept of visibility. And the reason visibility started feeling so complicated is because social media stopped feeling like an expression of who I am and started feeling like a way to prove who I am. Because when I was a teen, it was so simple. It was sharing tips, sharing what I found visually appealing, connecting emotionally, especially because I felt othered in my physical environment, like outside of my core group of friends that I had. It was not the best environment. But once my physical environment shifted and I was around more creatives, more spiritual people, and more people living alternative lifestyles, posting started to feel less appealing, even though it used to lead to a lot of interesting, cool opportunities for me. I was going through changes internally, like a micro spiritual awakening and a season of reevaluating myself, processing my life experiences, and how I moved through them. And of course, physically too, which I already talked about a few episodes ago, so I won't be a broken record. But all of that forced me to look at my relationship with visibility. And to be honest, some of my beliefs were misaligned. At one point, being visible felt like performing. It felt like pressure. It felt like I had to show up, quote unquote, as someone, not just show up as me. And because I was shifting other parts of my life at the same time, visibility felt like one more thing that added to the burnout, that led to the burnout. And there was also a season where hiding and isolation felt like protection and privacy felt like the better choice. So lately I've been reframing because what I'm currently learning is visibility is a gateway to agency. It's essentially me choosing to, from a lack of better words to think of, take up space on purpose. I know that was like part of the name of, I think, the first episode. But I've been having these thoughts and I was just like, I don't have to drain my creativity to create visibility. Because visibility doesn't have to mean constant frequency. Consistency can look like building on what I've already said and not always forcing something brand new. And that's where my current Substack goal came from and why it matters to me so much. Because with moving my older posts, I realized that I have all this work that I put so much effort into, like even if the grammar wasn't always perfect, because low-key, that's my downfall. The research is there, the emotions were there, the stories that were shared in those posts were there. And I started to think maybe I haven't put it out into the world the way I thought I was. I had to ask myself, was I taking aligned action or was I doing the bare minimum just to say I'm doing something? If you can't tell by what I'm saying, it's clear the answer already showed up because yes, I'm ambitious, but sometimes I think I confuse ambition with the need to constantly create something new. I mean, in terms of creation, of course, because obviously ambition can unfold in so many ways, but specifically in terms of creation, I think I started to realize that with the next level of creation, it is not about more, it's about deeper. It's about expanding on what's already there because I started to reflect on my beliefs, like old beliefs about visibility that was coming up. So in my head, my life is so boring and repetitive. How can I even make lifestyle content? I need to be more expressive and compelling with my creating and what I create. And in the process, I need to challenge myself to post more frequently. And I used to equate so often visibility with frequency because those type of challenges existed to post daily for a month, like Blogtober, Vlogmas, and like all the things. And somehow it looked so realistic for other people, but for me it was beyond my capacity and I would burn out, then resent myself for burning out. With this reframe, I'm now looking at it like visibility is not always about doing the most. It can look like depth and not just frequency. It can look like doubling down, not burning out, letting what I already created tell a bigger story, and just supporting it in a sustainable way through short form, repurposing, and consistently reminding people it exists. And maybe re-looking back at it to put my evolved perspective on it. And I don't always have to say everything in one post. I can leave room, save ideas for later to build on it. I can use old work and it's not lazy or unoriginal because it's honoring what I already made. So all that to say and reflect on like an action I was doing lately, I also wanted to share something that happened recently, like an interaction, because it made me think about visibility in a different way. This past Sunday, we had our first book club discussion for The Midnight Library. It is my second time reading that book, so going into it, I was like, I'm gonna try to keep an open mind, because even though I already know what happened in the book the last time I read it, it was like 2024. So I kind of knew what to expect from it, but I wanted to see like if looking at it from a different place of time would change my perspective. But I already knew how heavy it can get. The meeting itself was pretty good, and I enjoyed having people to talk about it with because they were very like thoughtful, and it wasn't just, okay, let's just recap the chapter. It was more like, what is this bringing up for you? And I'm not gonna lie, certain parts of the conversation were hard for me because if the Midnight Library touches on the quote unquote alt deleting yourself theme, and I'm saying it on purpose that way because I don't know what I can say without getting flagged. Like, I feel like regular podcast platforms have a little more freedom, but because this also goes on YouTube and there's AI moderation and stuff like that gets flagged so easily, I'm just trying to be careful, especially because my channel is still small and I just, don't want to accidentally say the wrong things. But anyways, the conversation started to go into, is it selfish / is it autonomy? Is it wrong to try to talk someone out of it? Does that go against their choice? That is just the surface level. And I'm going to be honest, I didn't say much when others were discussing it. Not because I think it's taboo, but because of my own history. It's a lot to add to that aspect of a conversation. Sometimes I still feel like I'm adjusting to this evolved version of myself. So I don't always know how to speak on topics that are connected to the older version of me without taking me somewhere I don't want to go mentally. So even when people make self-deprecating jokes, I don't know what to say or how to respond in those moments. Oh, and that wasn't something that happened with them. That's just in general. But I kind of just listened and let other people speak, and I didn't force myself. But outside of that part of the conversation, we also talked about choices and lifestyles, and I felt like it would be a great thing to talk about in this episode, even though I'm not going to fully recap. But I thought the interaction was an interesting thing because two things stood out to me. I asked someone about how were they feeling about Nora. And one thing they said was Nora was thinking too small for the life she wanted to live. That was true, but I also thought a lot of it was because she was living through her regrets, what she already knows. So it would be very hard for her to go beyond her imagination. And even in her quote unquote successful life is still related to something that she had semi-regrets in, or something she knew. And also in that conversation, we started talking about representation in media. Do you think representation matters when it comes to what you think is possible in your life? And that question came up because we already were talking about what other lives we could see for ourselves. And in my answer, I think I said I wasn't going to say quote unquote writer because I genuinely feel like writing is something I'm meant to engage with in this lifetime. But in an alternative life, I could see myself as a fashion designer. And I think that's what led to the question, because one thing I said was that fashion design dream was inspired by what I saw in media. Writing felt more natural in the terms I engaged with it because, like I said, how I grew up, I wrote with my Hawaiian friend. We collaborated. So for me, writing was always in a place of collaboration. But fashion came fully through media. And I always said it started with like True Jackson VP. But then I thought about it that True Jackson VP and That's So Raven were some of the only older kids, near tween shows I watched where there were Black girl leads. And ironic enough, the storylines both connected back to fashion. So it's like if I saw it, then it became a possibility in my head, because in real life, nobody in my family was in creative industries, or did any of the creative careers. It was always schools or nursing or social work, anything that was considered stable, service-based, paths. So without media, I don't think I would have even recognized fashion as something I could seriously want. Low-key, even when I went to college and chose my major, I didn't know what half of my major even meant. So my major was a combination of advertising, marketing, and communications. And I picked it for the communications part because under that major, you could have did regular journalism, and then magazine journalism was also an option. And I wanted to be a fashion journalist if I couldn't be a fashion designer. And when I tell you, I did not know what marketing was, I'm so serious. I knew what an ad was, but I didn't know how many roles existed in the world of advertisement. A lot of what I learned through what I saw, but it wasn't necessarily something I was told and taught directly beforehand. So when they asked if media representation matters to us and why, I said yes. And not because I always need to see myself to enjoy a story. I actually pretty much disagree with that. But because representation shows you options, possibilities outside of what you've been exposed to. So that whole conversation made me connect it back to visibility in a way that I wasn't expecting, because sometimes visibility isn't just about being seen. Sometimes it's about being shown what's possible. And if you're never shown, you can end up only choosing from what you already know, which is basically what Nora was doing. And that's why representation matters to me, even when it's not my exact representation. Like, I can feel excited when other people get to be centered in stories. For example, one of my favorite authors dropped a new book. It's called King of Gluttony. And that was at the end of April. And the female main character was a brown girl, Maya Singh. And the male main character was French descent, Sebastian Laurent. And when I tell you, I started that book May 1st, finished it May 2nd. It was devoured. I read that book so quickly, and I loved it because regardless of whether the FMC looks like me, it didn't really matter, because I loved that brown girls got that kind of story. And from what I've seen, many of them felt very seen by it and appreciated how the story was told and the details that went into it, like the research of cultural things. So anyways, 2 of the members said no, representation doesn't matter to them because they are used to seeing themselves as different or othered. But I think I saw the concept of representation different because I wasn't really thinking of it as needing to see a reflection of myself, but more of a portal to alternate realities and seeing people from all different types of backgrounds in varieties of location, social classes, facing different conflict and situations, and having different tastes and styles and upbringings can remind us that different realities could coexist in a lifetime, and no group of people is a monolith or as homogeneous as stereotypes tend to push. I think what also inspired my stance is that I'm also reading The Queen of Sugar Hill right now, which is a novel inspired by the life of Hattie McDaniel, the first Black person to win an Academy Award, specifically in the Best Supporting Actress category for her role as Mammy in Gone with the Wind. And what makes her story so interesting to me is how it was very layered. So the book starts off with her win. So for Hattie and a lot of Black actors at the time, that win could be seen as a real step forward because doors were not open, especially for Black actors. But for other Black people who are not in that field, it was hard to celebrate fully because the role she was rewarded for came from a stereotype that Hollywood kept recycling, and people saw it as playing into the stereotypes. I'm not going to give my full review right now, but this perspective stood out to me because I feel often people downplay creatives / people who pursue the arts, from media to fashion to beauty, and deem it as a self-centered pursuit, and that it engages deeper into capitalism, where I see those things as more digestible ways to pursue political messaging, because even if it is more subtle, that's why it's necessary, because sometimes people deem politics as too heavy and actively avoid it. But when you have a message you want out in the world and pursue it through the lens of art, fashion, books, movies, TV shows, etc., it still has influence in its own way. And I decided to read up more on Hattie and Walter White because the story does mention the criticism she got from the press and from the organizations like the NAACP. I will like to add, though, that many people acknowledge that despite their differences, they both fought against racism in their own ways. This aspect is a reminder that visibility isn't always clean and simple, that sometimes you're seen through very narrow lens, and the recognition sometimes comes with a cost. And I would also like to add that a lot of my curiosity about old Hollywood and representation comes from my time in college, especially when we were all in the house and Netflix dropped the show Hollywood, which I love that show. Around that time, I was deep in that era because I was taking classes like African American literature and a jazz dance course. So I kept noticing how history, culture, and media shaped what kinds of roles feel available for people. Reading the book made me research about milestones that came after Hattie. Diane Carroll, starring in Julia in 1968, which is often named as a major turning point for representation because she was one of the first Black women on TV in a non-stereotypical leading role as a professional middle-class woman, apparently. So to bring it back to the point of the episode, that book club meeting reminded me that visibility and agency are essentially very connected because of the conversation we were having. But also it made me realize, all in all, that the more exposure you have to possibility, the more agency you have over your life. Most of the time, we don't know how to look for what we don't know. We search for what's familiar, and then if something new shows up in the process, we branch off from there. That is why visibility matters, not just being seen, but being exposed to new options, new lifestyles, and new versions of what could be true for you. And, at the same time, visibility is a double-edged sword, because when you pursue it through things people tend to view as surface level, such as, content creation, beauty, fashion, lifestyle, it's easy to get misunderstood, and that misunderstanding can make you want to hide. But hiding doesn't protect your agency, it shrinks it to essentially nothing. There are so many ways to create visibility for your ideas, your values, and your way of thinking, but I don't think we always recognize that or realize how visibility can create agency for the person pursuing it. For me, I think people in my immediate life sometimes see the effort I put into creating and assume the end goal is quote unquote influencer, especially because I'm doing it by myself and obviously not getting paid for it. But honestly, it's not the point. I can picture so many different avenues for myself, like hosting events, authoring books, building, a very specific business, or even, working in a role that shapes the skills I want to have. So there's a lot I see out of my life, and content creation is just one aspect that can lead to many. If people can see how I think, recognize the value in it, and see my skills through the execution, it can open doors, not necessarily as an influencer, but just as a portfolio. And truthfully, I don't care which avenue happens first, as long as something real comes from it. And that actually reminds me of another aspect of the conversation we had, because we were speaking about what a successful life meant for us. And I think I said something along the lines that a successful life for me would be having the freedom to do whatever I please at any given moment. Now, I do consider myself spiritual, but not in the sense that I can ignore reality or present circumstances. And I know that is a big part of some people's way of perceiving spirituality. But if I believe change is the only constant in life, then I don't necessarily see circumstances as something, permanent either. So I don't necessarily need to ignore something that is going to change, So I don't need to ignore something that is going to change. I can look at it briefly to know what my options for aligned actions are, then focus my attention on the process. I can't inherently ignore my reality, because if I could do what I want to do, it would just be traveling all over the world, anywhere and everywhere, being an endless learner, paying for one-on-one classes because that's just how I learn best, and writing books and blog posts and newsletters. But also, if I want to do anything else, I can just do it, whether it's, get another degree or go to culinary school or become an interior designer or a fashion designer or a photographer. To connect this back to visibility and agency, because that longing to live multiple lives in a lifetime is such a common human feeling. And that is why it's one of my more commonly viewed episodes, because I had talked about this before, I think maybe August. We all have these different versions of ourselves we can see so clearly, but under capitalism, it can start to feel like you need monetary capital to access any of them, which makes your current circumstance feels like a limitation instead of a launch pad for the life you want to live. But something I've been thinking about this past week, because of reflecting on the conversations, is how to balance visibility of circumstances with visibility of desires. So being honest about, what is in reality right now without letting that honesty shrink what a person believes is possible. Because when you look at your circumstances, you can usually find entry points, ways to engage with those multiple lives through action, even if the full title or the lifestyle isn't accessible yet. And heavy on yet, because it could happen at any point in time. Maybe your primary income comes from B2B writing or strategy, but you still create outside of that. Maybe you take a fitness class on the weekends, then go on photography walks with friends, stop at a cafe and discover something you want to learn how to recreate. So you go and do your grocery run and prep to cook Sunday. And then on Sunday, you do your self-care rituals. Then you attend book club that night. And even though you don't have the titles, you're still interacting with the lives you want. And that's still a full life because of the layers and intentionality and the expansiveness behind them. So sometimes the problem isn't the dream, but it's the fixation on the titles more than the actions that make the dreams real. Agency is choosing the actions anyways, while visibility keeps you grounded in what you can build from where you are. All right, before I wrap up this episode, because my voice is slowly disappearing, I hope this episode gave you a new way to look at visibility, whether that's the visibility in the obvious sense of putting yourself out there, or the visibility in the quieter sense of being honest about your circumstances while staying connected to your desires. Because yes, visibility can be a double-edged sword. Being seen can bring opportunity, connection, and expansion, but it can also bring projection, misunderstanding, and that feeling of being under a gaze that makes you want to shrink yourself, shrink back, But that is exactly why I want to offer this reframe in thinking. If you see visibility as a pathway to agency, it becomes more neutral, less about performing, less about proving, and just about choosing. Choosing how you show up for yourself, what you share, what you build, and what you make available in your life. And the key to not getting overwhelmed in that process is having identity anchors, your non-negotiables, the rituals, the values, the boundaries that keep you grounded. So when you are visible, you're not abandoning yourself to be quote unquote more palatable. You're not performing. You're just participating in life as yourself, which is why June's theme is all about spark. I know a lot of people love summer, and summer can be fun and everything, but for some reason, summer for me is always a season of evolution, a season where something shifts. And I've noticed through analytics that y'all are interested in the topic of spark. So in the next episodes coming in June, which will either be, June 1st or June 8th, depending on when I can get this out, we're going to talk about what it actually looks like to reignite your spark through the lens of like glamour and joy and fun and, just all the things. So thank you for being here. And now it's time for the card pull. Remember, if card pulls aren't your thing, and this is usually where you click off, thank you for listening. And be sure to come back next month. Follow the podcast so you can stay up to date with new episodes, catch up on old episodes, and of course, rate the podcast 5 stars so more like-minded people can add this to their content rotation. So with all that being said, today we're using the mini tarot deck instead of an oracle deck since it's been a little while. And I asked the question, what do we collectively need to know about visibility and agency in regards to circumstances and desire? The cards we got were the Star card upright, Knight of Wands in reverse, and Two of Cups upright. And my interpretation is that this spread essentially ties everything that I already said together, that visibility is meant to be intentional and not frantic. Because with the Star upright, it feels like a reminder that you're quote unquote being seen grows from hope, healing, and a long range vision. So trusting that what you're creating has meaning before it gets rewarded publicly. And that, of course, doesn't mean you ignore what's happening before the outcome. It means you change your perspective on the experience while the outcome is still unfolding. And the Knight of Wands reversed feels like kind of like a cautionary tale in this instance, where visibility can turn into proving yourself through overposting, rushing, and chasing spikes of attention. And overall, it scatters your energy and can turn your agency into burnout. So as I mentioned, what I'm doing is, focusing on depth over frequency. So to have a more focused output, clear messaging, and sustainable pacing, and just showing up from a place of clarity and not a high adrenaline. And last of all, the Two of Cups upright, I believe shows the how we get to that level of visibility. And it seems like it comes through connection, being witnessed, by people who genuinely get you, and building partnerships that feel balanced and safe and just mutually supportive. And I think that was a good thing that I didn't get to really mention that much in this episode, since we talked about it so much in last episode when we were focused more on clubs and activities. But I 100% agree that it kind of wraps up everything we talked about this month. I think it bridges into June's theme so well. I think going from this theme of agency into spark shows it's choosing a pace that makes you feel inspired, choosing spaces that make you feel seen, and choosing collaboration that pours back into you and you can equally pour back into them. And that is how you stay visible and stay yourself. So that is all for today. Thank you for tuning into today's episode of A Little Atypical. If you found this helpful, don't forget to subscribe and share this with someone who might need to hear this message. Remember, view the description box where you can find important links such as the one to my website and the one to my Substack, where there is so much more bonus content. Until next time, have a good day, evening, or night, and stay authentically atypical. Okay, bye.